few announcements as always before we get started. I'd ask to remind you to please turn off your cell phones and other electronic devices. Everybody's been doing a really good job at that, and I appreciate it. Our next forum next Friday will be with Superintendent of Public Instruction, Susan Castillo. The program will be our Oregon Schools Making the Grade. We have 3 new members to introduce today. Donald Winslow, Michelle Moore Hernandez, and Jane Gigler. If you're here, would you mind standing up so we can welcome you? And speaking of membership and also the holiday season, we ask you to consider giving the gift of City Club this holiday season. And in the back, Margaret Eichmann can help you with a gift purchase of a City Club membership for a family member or somebody else who could benefit from joining us. If you join today, a couple of things. We have a few prizes for the first 3 people who buy a membership, and we'll also waive the $25 membership initiation fee. Some upcoming events to mention are we're initiating a research study to look deeper into voter-owned elections and re-examine the club's position on Portland's voter-owned elections in preparation for a repeal effort that will be on the May 2006 ballot. If you're interested in participating as a member of that study, please contact Research Director Wade Fickler. A couple of upcoming City Club Issue Committee events to note. The Business and Technology Committee will meet 7:30, 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday, December 7th at the City Club Commons. Their program will feature Jean Hart, Executive Director of Social Venture Partners, to discuss Social Venture Partners, a unique business community partnership. And the Education and Human Development Committee will be meeting with Mayor Tom Potter at 12 noon on Tuesday, December 13th for a continued discussion of education for social justice. We haven't yet set the location for that, so please check the City Club website. All of our events are listed on the City Club website, where you can also find broadcasts of our City Club Friday programs. Our sponsors this quarter are McEwen Gisbold LLP and Medico Support Services of the Northwest Incorporated. Our sponsors make broadcasts of the City Club possible, so would you please join me in thanking them. To our program. The trends in U.S. government spending chart a looming crisis. The annual federal budget deficits are growing, the national debt burden consumes an increasing portion of tax dollars, and in the past year, the cost of recovery from 3 catastrophic hurricanes add to the burden of spending for the war in Iraq at a time when the aging U.S. population drives increased demands for Social Security and health care. Today's speaker is David Walker, Comptroller General of the United States. He comes to Portland as part of a national tour to raise public awareness of the tough choices facing our nation's fiscal policy. As Comptroller General, Mr. Walker is head of the U.S. Government Accountability Office, a legislative branch agency founded in 1921. The GAO serves as an independent reviewer of government functions and issues numerous studies of how government operates. I just want to also point out that Gary Blackburn, who performs this function for us in the city of Portland, is here with us today and does a great job of that here. It falls to the Comptroller General to question the rosy budget scenarios painted by both the Congress and the President. Mr. Walker was appointed Comptroller General in 1998 to a 15-year term, a tenure intended to support his independent status. Before his appointment as Comptroller General, Mr. Walker was a partner at Arthur Andersen LLP. While there, he served as a public trustee for Social Security and Medicare. Before joining Arthur Andersen, he was Assistant Secretary of Labor, and in 1985, he was the Acting Executive Director of the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. Welcome to the City Club of Portland, David Walker.
God, thank you for that kind introduction, and I would like to thank the City Club for the invitation to be here before you today. As Doug mentioned, I am part of the Fiscal Wake Up Call Tour, and Portland is the 3rd city on our national tour. We have 7 other cities scheduled, and we have 20 other cities that want to be part of this effort. I call our group the Truth Squad. Some call us the Doom and Gloom group. Number one, I don't think that's accurate. Number two, I don't think that's fair. And number three, I don't think that's constructive, because quite frankly, we have too many people that are in denial. We have too many people that don't want to face the facts as to where we are and where we're headed. And while there may be red and blue states, and while there may be Republicans and Democrats, the facts do not have a color, and the facts do not lie. And so today, what I'm going to try to do is to provide you an overview of where we are and where we're headed in a professional, objective, fact-based, nonpartisan, non-ideological, and hopefully fair and balanced manner. But I want to save plenty of time for questions, because quite frankly, I enjoy that the most. And frankly, I know I'm addressing something you care about if you ask me a question. But if I can, let me get started. Today, I'd like to brighten the lights and turn up the heat to talk about several of the 4 deficits that face the United States. The first deficit is our federal budget deficit. The second deficit is our balance of payments deficit, of which the trade imbalance is a subset. The third is our nation's savings deficit. And the fourth, and possibly the most serious, is our nation's leadership deficit. First and foremost, our nation's financial condition is worse than advertised. We face large and growing structural deficits due primarily to known demographic trends, the retirement of my generation, the baby boom generation, rising healthcare costs, and lower federal revenues as a percentage of the economy than historically has been the case. Our recent annual budget deficits have far exceeded the cost associated with a global war against terrorism, meaning Iraq, Afghanistan, as well as incremental homeland security costs. While the fiscal 2005 budget deficit, which ended September 30, 2005, was down almost $100 billion from the fiscal 2004 deficit, it was still imprudently high. In fact, in fiscal 2005, your government at the federal level ran an operating or on-budget deficit of close to $500 billion, of which only about $100 billion had anything to do with Iraq, Afghanistan, or incremental homeland security costs. And yet, our country has not been in a recession since November of 2001. We had the strongest economic growth rate of any major industrialized nation. So how can one justify running deficits of that size? The answer is, you can't. It's fundamentally imprudent. More importantly, our nation's liabilities and unfunded commitments for things like Social Security and Medicare, have grown from $20 trillion. There's 12 zeros behind for trillion, but behind the 20. From $20 trillion at the end of fiscal 2000 to about $46 trillion today. How do you translate numbers like that into terms that people can understand and relate to? Well, let me give you a couple of numbers that might resonate. First, the estimated net worth of every American in the United States, including Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, every billionaire, and including the total value of all home equity, which has risen significantly in recent years, was recently estimated to be $48.5 trillion. Therefore, we would have to confiscate over 90% of the net worth of every American immediately and invest it at Treasury rates in order to be able to close the hole between what liabilities we have and what promises we've made for the future. Stated differently, every newborn baby that is born in America today comes with the birth certificate, a birth burden of over $150,000. And every full-time worker in the United States has a burden of over $370,000. The average annual compensation in the United States is $50,000. This burden is growing every day due to continuing deficits, known demographic trends, and compounding interest costs. While when you're an investor, the miracle of compounding can work for you because earnings on earnings are good, when you're a debtor, the miracle of compounding works against you. And the United States is now the world's largest debtor nation. Many of you may have read Tom Friedman's book, The Earth is Flat. That book, which has been on the bestseller list for a number of weeks now, addresses the increasing interconnectivity and interdependency in today's world. The simple fact of the matter is that most of the challenges that we face in the United States are shared challenges that other countries face as well. Whether it's combating terrorism, promoting stable markets, fighting infectious diseases, promoting a clean environment, these are challenges that do not stop at a state or national border. And one has to partner for progress with other countries, as well as between the federal, state, local government, public sector, private sector, and not-for-profit sector in order to be successful. And while he's right in saying that many of the challenges that we face cause the earth to be flat, there is another challenge that we face that must recognize that from a fiscal standpoint, the earth is round. And by what I mean by that is, many times when Washington is talking about looking at the cost of tax cuts or spending increases, they will look at the 1-year cost and the 10-year cost, but they will not consider the long-term affordability and sustainability beyond 10 years. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you that Columbus determined that the earth is not flat, that it is round. And from a fiscal standpoint, at the horizon of our round earth, we face an unprecedented demographic tidal wave, the retirement of the baby boom generation, which will have tremendous budget, fiscal, economic, workforce, and other implications for our nation. This demographic tidal wave is destiny. There is no question that it will hit us. In 2008, the first baby boomer reaches age 62 and therefore is eligible for early retirement. That's just a little over 2 years from now. In 2011, the first baby boomer reaches age 65 and will be eligible for Medicare. This generation and the related costs associated therewith will result in significant increased Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid costs, and it will bring the type of pressures that I talked about before from a budget, economic, workforce, and other dimensions. The simple but sad truth is that while we have known for years that this demographic tidal wave is going to hit us, we are unprepared for the approaching wave. If we are not careful, this wave could swamp the ship of state. Why are we unprepared? Because we don't have enough leaders on either side of the aisle or on either end of Pennsylvania Avenue with the courage, integrity, and innovative ability to rise above partisan politics and ideological battles and do what is right for our country, for our children, and for our grandchildren's future. We have way too many people focusing on today, on the next election cycle, not enough people preparing for tomorrow. Leadership requires that you not just leave things better off when you leave than when you came, but that you be an effective steward, and that you leave things better positioned for the future. Stewardship is an important and powerful word, but few people are practicing stewardship, whether it be in the private sector, the public sector, or in some cases, the not-for-profit sector. America suffers from myopia or nearsightedness, tunnel vision, delusion, and denial. This must change. The numbers are clear and compelling, and the consequences of inaction, of failure to deal with our long-range fiscal imbalance, could be catastrophic. Absent serious action soon, it's only a matter of time before we face a crisis. One way that this crisis might manifest itself is if foreign investors, who we have become increasingly reliant upon to finance our excess consumption, if they decide they no longer want to buy U.S. Treasury securities to the same extent that they have in recent years. You may or may not know that in fiscal 2005, over 90% of new U.S. government debt was purchased by foreign players. Some of these foreign players do not share the same economic, foreign policy, or national security interests of the United States. As a result, we are increasingly turning over part of our future destiny to foreign players. Foreign players who hold an increasing percentage of the mortgage on America's future. And believe it or not, you don't have a whole lot of leverage over your mortgage holder. Why have we had to rely upon foreign players in order to be able to finance our excess consumption, both at the national level, frankly, and at the individual level? Because the United States, while being the only superpower on earth and number one on many things, is not number one on everything. And we're laggards in a number of important areas. And one of the important areas is we have the lowest savings rate of any major industrialized nation. And the reason that we have to rely upon China, Japan, OPEC nations, Korea, and many other players to finance our deficits is because we don't have the savings to do it ourselves. The United States is not leading by example as it relates to fiscal prudence and responsibility. It is spending well above its means. And guess what? Many Americans are doing the same thing. Debt is increasing rapidly, and with increased debt, you have increased future risk. If we do not mend our ways and put ourselves on a more prudent path, our nation's economic growth, competitive posture, quality of life, and ultimately national security may be at risk. While the numbers that I have discussed are both big and bad, our fiscal challenge is not just about numbers, it's about values. Today's deficits are putting more of a load on the backs of our children and grandchildren. Every deficit dollar today is likely to result in a dollar plus of tax increases on our children and grandchildren. As George Washington, our first president, said, we should avoid ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burdens that we ourselves ought to bear. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not heeding Washington's words of wisdom today. We are not discharging our stewardship responsibilities to our country, our children, and our grandchildren. And we should be ashamed of that. We need to heed Washington's timeless words of wisdom, and we need to discharge our stewardship responsibilities to our country, our children, and our grandchildren. We have both a patriotic duty and a moral obligation to do nothing less. I expect that after you've heard this, you may have some concerns. And yes, these numbers are huge, and they are sobering. But let me assure you that I am not a pessimist. And in fact, individuals who know me know that I am very much an optimist. At the same point in time, I am a realist. We can and must come to grips with this large and growing fiscal challenge. America has faced many challenges before in the past, and we've always risen to the challenge. We can do so again in this area. The difficulty is that historically, in dealing with major challenges, the political process has not wanted to deal with it until it absolutely, positively had to. For example, in 1983, when the Social Security system was reformed the last time, we were within weeks of not sending out the checks on time. That is why action was taken. But the modern day equivalent of 1983 for Social Security is 2041. At the same point in time, based upon realistic assumptions, not paying Social Security on time in 2041 may be one of our least challenges. Because if we don't mend our ways and start making some tough choices, then the United States may not be able to pay its debts by 2041. What are some of the things that we need to do, or that we need to consider doing, in order to put ourselves on a more prudent path? First, we must reimpose budget controls and modify the legislative process. Remember the first rule of holes. When you're in a hole, stop digging. We are still digging at or near record rates, and we haven't hit the demographic tidal wave yet. We need to have discretionary spending caps, pay-as-you-go rules that deal with both tax cuts and spending increases. We need to have mandatory reconsideration triggers on the majority of the budget that is on autopilot and has not been subject to fundamental review and reexamination in years. We need to have automatic disclosure of the long-term cost, affordability, and sustainability of major tax cut and spending increase proposals before they're enacted into law. And let me give you the poster child of that: the Medicare prescription drug benefit. When the Medicare prescription drug benefit was passed in December of 2003, there was a debate as to whether it was going to cost $395 billion or some other number. First, that $395 billion number was only based upon the estimated 10-year cost. It assumed that there would be no cost beyond 10 years, which we obviously know is not the case. We found out later that the Medicare actuary assumed that for that 10-year period it would cost $534 billion, but it was not disclosed. And so therefore, $395 was presumed to be the cost. 3.5 months after that bill was passed, in the dead of the night, 3.5 months later, the Medicare trustees, of which I used to be one, issued their annual report noting that we would have to have $8.1 trillion today invested in Treasury rates to deliver on that promise. That $8.1 trillion is now about $9 trillion today. $8.1 trillion was more than the entire debt of the United States outstanding since the beginning of the Republic in 1789. At the time that that bill was passed, Medicare was already in the hole, $15 to $20 trillion. And this added another $8.1 trillion. Medicare today is in the hole about $30 trillion. Almost 8 times greater than the estimated hole for Social Security, which is about $4 trillion. We also need to make sure that members actually have to read some of this legislation before they vote on it. It sounds like a novel concept, and in some cases, in many capitals, it is a novel concept. We need to improve our financial reporting to provide a fuller and fairer view as to where we are and to where we're headed. Do you realize that the amount of money the United States government owes to Social Security and Medicare, the bonds that are in the trust funds, are not deemed to be liabilities of the United States government from a financial reporting standpoint? Because the left hand owes the right hand. I would respectfully suggest that needs to change, because we took the people's money, the government spent the people's money, and then replaced it with an IOU that is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It's guaranteed as to principal interest. It will be delivered on. It has legal, political, and moral significance. It has no economic significance whatsoever. Because when you have to start cashing in those bonds, you're either going to have to raise taxes, cut other spending, or go and borrow more from farmers. That's what we're going to have to do. The other thing that we need to do is that we need to develop a set of key national outcome-based indicators for the United States. The United States spends $2.5 trillion a year at the federal level, grants hundreds of billions of dollars of tax preferences, and yet, number one, the executive branch doesn't have a strategic plan, it never has. No executive branch administration has. And secondly, we don't have a set of safety, security, economic, social, environmental indicators, outcome-based indicators, in order to assess our nation's position and progress over time and relative to others. We need this in order to enhance strategic planning, to promote better performance and accountability reporting, and to understand which programs and policies are working and which ones aren't working, because right now, in the absence of this, the assumption is if you want to do something about a problem, you spend more, you give more tax cuts, or you create new government entities. Ladies and gentlemen, they don't necessarily solve anything. We have to understand what spending programs are working, which tax policies are working, and which ones aren't, and who's benefiting from them. Because right now, we're not going to be able to sustain everything that we have. We are working with the national academies, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and others to try to help make this a reality. Because otherwise, we are flying blind, and we are about ready to enter rough skies. Last but certainly not least, we need to recognize the reality that given our large and growing projected fiscal imbalance, for the reasons that I articulated, we need to do three things. We are going to have to restructure Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Social Security should be easy lifting. You can reform Social Security and exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans if you just get on with it. I'm happy to answer questions on that if you want. Medicare will be much, much tougher because it's 8 times greater in the way of an imbalance, and it's a much more emotional issue, and there's not a path forward at the present point in time. We're going to have to re-examine the base of all federal spending and tax policies. Believe it or not, a vast majority of the federal government's policies, programs, functions, and activities today are based upon conditions that existed in the United States and in the world in the 1950s and the 1960s. Because once it gets into the base, it doesn't get re-examined and reconsidered to the extent that it should. The base is not only unacceptable, it is unsustainable, and it is not well aligned with 21st century challenges and opportunities. Ultimately, we're going to have to also look at tax policy, including tax preferences. What are they resulting in and who's benefiting from them? What level of taxation will we need in order to pay our current bills and deliver on our future promises? Nobody likes taxes, me included. But in the final analysis, we are going to have to reform entitlement programs, cut spending, and look at the revenue side. All three, eventually. The debate will be what weighting, what priority, what order. But that's what the democratic process is all about. We will have to do all three because the gap is simply too great to grow your way out of the problem. Anybody who tells you we're going to grow our way out of this problem, number one, would fail economic history, and number two, would fail math. It's that simple. In addition to these steps, we will also have to engage in comprehensive health care reform. The single largest domestic policy challenge that we face, as a subset of our fiscal challenge, is health care. Health care is a major driver to our long-range fiscal imbalance. Costs are out of control, and quality is not consistent or as good as it should be. Yes, we will need to reform both Medicare and Medicaid, but that will not be enough. Ultimately, due to rapidly rising healthcare costs, which also serve to undercut the competitive posture of American business, we are going to have to reform our entire healthcare system in installments over a number of years. Many people do not understand that because of rising healthcare costs, it's not just increasing the pressures on federal and state budgets, but it's also resulting in reduced employment growth, reduced wage growth, reduced pension coverage and generosity, and reduced individual income tax growth, because more and more of total compensation for individuals, whether you're in government, the private sector, or the not-for-profit sector, is coming in the form of healthcare costs. And if there's anything that could bankrupt the nation, it's healthcare costs. Because there is a fundamental disconnect between unlimited individual wants in the area of healthcare and broad-based societal needs and how much we can afford and sustain as a nation over time. We are going to have to take steps to deal with certain issues in the short term, and I'm happy to answer questions on that, but ultimately we're going to have to reform our entire system in the longer term, and I'm happy to take some questions on that. In closing, America is the greatest country on the face of the earth. I have had the good fortune to travel to all 50 states and about 90 countries around the world during my lifetime. And I love traveling to be able to experience new countries, new cultures, new cuisines, and I also love coming home because you don't realize how good you have it until you have something else to compare it to. And while we are number one in many things in this country, we are not number one in everything. And while we are the only superpower on earth today, that is temporary. There will be other superpowers in the future. It is important that we recognize that reality. It is important that we recognize that we cannot and should not go it alone in many different areas. It is also important to understand that while we're number one in many things, that there are certain critically important areas where we have flashing red lights. For example, we spend 15% of our economy on health care, and yet we have below average life expectancy, infant mortality, and above average medical error rates for an industrialized nation. We have the best post-secondary education system in the world, but we are number 25 in the world on K through 12 education. In a knowledge-based economy, that is a big red flashing light. The United States cannot compete on wages. We will get beaten every day. We don't want to compete on wages because that means lowering our standard of living. We must compete based on productivity, innovation, and quality. We must do more to raise our math proficiency, our science proficiency, and to be in a better competitive posture for innovation and technological enhancement as we look forward, or else we will suffer the consequences. We need to get serious soon about addressing our long-range fiscal imbalance because it is growing every day. Please join me in stating the facts, speaking the truth, and encouraging responsible parties to begin to take steps to create a more positive future for our country. And please remember, in closing, the words of Teddy Roosevelt, one of my favorite presidents. Aggressive fighting for the right cause is the noblest sport the world affords. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
We now open the floor to questions. Questions are a privilege for City Club members only, and they should have a question mark at the end. The first question will come from our board host, Corleen Kraft. Corleen is immediate past president of the City Club and a real estate broker with the Hassan Family. Corleen?
Well, thank you, I think. I know that our typical City Club audience member, both in the room and on television and radio, has been aware that there are some pretty dire consequences about the fiscal policy in the U.S. And I thank you so much for bringing actual numbers to it. They're even more frightening probably than most of us thought. The fact that you've had to take your show on the road, as it were, would seem to indicate to me that you may not be heard back in home territory. And I'm wondering, how is it possible to keep your neutrality with the pressure from the administration and pressure from the legislature, and yet wanting to get your message out? You've asked us to try to take some steps to help the message get out there. How much pressure is there on you, and does anybody listen to you back there?
Well, first, there has to be a dual-pronged strategy in order to be successful in this area. The first prong has to be inside the so-called Beltway, because ultimately the decision makers are inside the Beltway, in the executive and the legislative branch of government. However, in order for them to be in a position and to be willing to make tough decisions, the ground has to be tilled. And the ground has to be tilled around America. Because many of our elected officials, in fact most, want to be re-elected. And many of our elected officials are not comfortable with taking on very difficult challenges until they have to, or until they believe the American people understand the need to do so. I think we have to keep in mind that the three most powerful words in the U.S. Constitution are the first three words: we, the people. And that ultimately, the people are responsible and accountable for the actions or inactions of their elected officials. And my view is, many people do not understand how serious our situation is, and that elected officials are going to have to make some very tough choices. And so I actually think I'm doing them a favor. I'm doing them a favor by stating the facts and speaking the truth, and hopefully preparing the ground to be able to start taking some steps. But I honestly believe it's going to take 20 plus years to get us on a more prudent and sustainable path. But we need to start now. And the other thing is that some people say, well, gee, how can I do this? Don't I come under a lot of pressure? As long as I'm stating the facts, speaking the truth, not blaming any particular party, any particular person, trying to just do it in a professional, fact-based, constructive, nonpartisan, non-ideological fashion, I think I'll be fine. And so far I am.
City Club member. Mr. Walker, Oregon Senator Gordon Smith has discovered that if he votes for every conceivable tax cut, but then fights bravely against cuts to Medicaid, nobody attacks him for exploiting the deficit. Instead, he's praised as a thoughtful, moderate leader. What can we do to convince at least the news media that fiscal recklessness is neither moderation nor leadership?
Well, first, as I mentioned, I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to stop digging, and we also have to recognize reality that if you want to try to get control of the deficit, you've got to look at both the spending side and the tax side. One of the debates in Washington is, well, gee, yes, we need to control spending. I think there's a pretty broad-based consensus we need to do that. By the way, spending has been increasing at the fastest rate since Lyndon Johnson in the last several years. But we also need to look at the tax side. Not all tax cuts stimulate the economy, and very few tax cuts pay for themselves. In fact, the vast majority do not. And therefore, one of the things that we have to do is to hold our legislators, whether they be Democrats or Republicans, accountable for their past votes, and to ask them for what their future plans are to be able to put us on a more prudent path. And in that regard, one has to recognize that you cannot necessarily trust the title of some bills. There are some bills right now that call themselves deficit reduction, and they actually increase the deficit. Because if you cut spending by $50 billion, but you cut taxes by 70, the bottom line is 20 worse off. Thank you.
Mark Anderson, City Club member. I'd like to bring us back to the we, what we can do sooner rather than later, and to address what I agree with you with is the bankruptcy that we're looking at as healthcare costs. I'd like you to comment on two major ways of reducing those spending right now, which is much higher payment from individuals for their own individual health care. Not just their premiums, but the co-pays at the time of service, and also the runaway costs on pharmaceuticals and how we can get a better handle on that.
Well, first, when you look at the statistics, between 1964 and 2004, most of the increased cost of health care has been borne by two groups: government at the federal and state level, and employers. Individuals have, on a relative basis, largely been insulated from the increased cost. That is changing. There's more cost shifting going on now, coverage levels are being modified, and now individuals are starting to feel the pressure. I believe that in the short term, there are things that can and should be done, such as, believe it or not, for Medicare and Medicaid, there's no such thing as large case management. The fact that a vast majority of the costs are attributable to a relatively small number of individuals, and to try to understand what's being done and why, does that make sense? Also for the individual, because sometimes things are done to them that frankly don't make sense for them, in addition to costing a lot of money. We've got to leverage technology to a much greater extent than we have. We need national standards of practice in healthcare. Do you realize that depending upon where you live in the United States, the likelihood that you're going to have invasive surgery for a particular procedure is much greater in some areas of the country than others. The costs are much greater in some areas of the country than others, and the outcomes are much better or worse in some areas of the country than others. We need to have national standards of practice in order to improve consistency, reduce costs, and enhance quality outcomes. We need to leverage purchasing power, for example, in prescription drugs. To leverage purchasing power, the VA gets a great deal on prescription drugs, but no other government agency does. And we need to understand that we need to think about doing something there. And we need to look at cost sharing. Everybody wants unlimited health care as long as somebody else is willing to pay for it. I would also respectfully suggest that for any system to work, whether it's a tax system, a healthcare system, a governance system, you fill in the blank, you've got to have three things. Number one, incentives for people to do the right thing. Number two, transparency to provide reasonable assurance they will do the right thing because somebody is looking. And number three, accountability if people do the wrong things. We don't have anyone in healthcare. We've got to look at tax preferences for healthcare. The single largest tax preference in the Internal Revenue Code, over $150 billion a year, which is quite frankly desensitizing people to the cost of health care, among other things. But in the final analysis, I think we have to answer a basic question, which we've never answered. What type of health care coverage is it in our broad-based societal interest as a nation to make sure that every American has? Let me clarify what I mean by that. Basic and essential, not Cadillac, because if you look at it, such things as inoculations against infectious disease, certain types of wellness and preventative services, guaranteed access, guaranteed insurability at group rates, and protection against financial ruin due to unexpected catastrophic illness, where you're not engaging in heroic measures, where you really meaningfully can improve or extend life. Those are basic and essential, I would argue. Maybe there's some others. We have 40-something million Americans that don't have that. On the other hand, we have many Americans that have way more than that, and they're not paying for it. And so we're going to have to understand that we need to address basic and essential. We need to provide opportunities and mechanisms for people to get more than that if they want, but if they want more than that, they're going to have to bear more of the cost and or more of the risk.
Peter Fenner from City Club. If you were running for president in the next election, you've got some supporters. What program would you push that you think would solve part of the problem, but not cause you to not be elected?
Well, first let me say, I think we need more people in office who are willing to do the right thing, even if they may not get reelected. I think if you go back to the founding fathers, they didn't even envision full-time politicians, much less career politicians. All right. Now we need full-time politicians. I mean, governments, the country's a lot bigger, it's a lot more complex. We need that. My personal view is we don't necessarily need career politicians, and it's more, especially people that stay in the same job for year after year after year. The answer to your question, I think, is you go to the people and you tell them the truth. I believe the American people are a lot smarter than people give them credit for. And I believe that most Americans are in what I call the sensible center. They may be center right, they may be center left, okay? But unfortunately, while most Americans are in the sensible center, while they're smarter than people give them credit for, and while they'll enable you and empower you to do the right thing if they're given the facts and told the truth, most of their elected representatives are not in the sensible center. Most elected representatives are on the right or on the left. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And, politics is the art of compromise. It really is. You don't have to throw out your principles, all right? But I think you got to go to the people as the answer. Tell them the facts, and speak the truth, and they'll let you. And if you don't get reelected, so be it. You did the right thing.
My name is Sharon Joy, a City Club member, and I've been a recipient of what you're concerned about for many years. I've been in the wheelchair for 27. And I've, of course, found lots of ways we could save money and improve the system. And one of them is we'd still like to work, and we have to literally say, hey, we're desperate. We have nothing before we can get any assistance. And I think that should be built in. And okay, what I'm saying is, where do I start? I think your prong needs one extra spot, and that is the seed that is put in, or the ideas. I have the ideas, but I don't know where to plant them. How do you suggest we start from the bottom?
Well, frankly, the reason that we're on this tour now is to plant seeds. Among people to try to get them informed and involved in trying to help go to the responsible people who are the decision makers, elected officials, other people in the executive branch, whether it's at the state level or the federal level or wherever else, who are responsible for administering and managing these programs, to try to be able to encourage them to start taking steps and to give them ideas as to what you think should be done. I mean, I don't know how many of you are politically active, and I don't care whether you're Democrats or Republicans or liberals or conservatives, but frankly, I will tell you that in a number of the town hall meetings I've been at, these kinds of issues are not being addressed and ideas are not coming forth. Thank you.
I'm a City Club and Green Party member. Many of us feel that campaign finance reform, of course, would elect officials who would answer to their conscience and not to the supporters who gave them money. Some of us feel the way to get at it. For years, we've understood, most of us, that multinational corporations are running the world, and our government is less powerful than the corporations. You might be happy to know that Tom Hartman, who wrote We the People, is here and has breathed a group into life that's working on in-corporate personhood. Would you have any suggestions for how we can move this issue forward?
I think ultimately we're going to need additional campaign finance reform. One of the things that we've done at GAO is to study some of the campaign finance reform efforts of the states. There are some states that have full or partial funding for elections. For example, Arizona and Maine. And we are looking at that to try to understand the pluses and the minuses associated with that. I think we're also going to have to look at issues like redistricting. What ends up happening in redistricting today is whichever party controls the state legislature, they end up drawing the lines to maximize the number of safe seats for their party. When they do that, it polarizes the process, because what happens is the more safe seats you have, it means that if it's a Democratic seat, that it's decided in the primary. And for the Democratic Party, the activists in the Democratic Party tend to be more liberal than the population. If it's a safe Republican seat, they tend to be, if it's decided in the primary, they tend to be more conservative than the population as a whole. And so as a result, that's why there's not much of a sensible center in the House of Representatives. And you have more people coming from the House to the Senate with a winner-take-all attitude, with an ideological bent from one side or the other. And so we're going to need to do something on campaign finance reform. We're going to need to do something on redistricting and other issues, but we can't wait. We need to do what we can before those things happen.
Bill Savage, City Club member. Mr. Walker, you mentioned that we need to look at both the cost side and the revenue side. And my feeling is people, our representatives, nod and say yes, but then just address the cost side. So my question to you, as directly as I can make it, is can we get out of this hole? Can we stop digging without actually increasing taxes?
Well, first, some facts. Today, we're spending at the rate of about 20% of our economy at the federal level. We are taxing at the rate of 16 to 17% of our economy, all right? So we've got a gap right now, and this is before we've had the demographic tidal wave. In my opinion, you're going to have to do all three things that I mentioned. You're going to have to reform entitlement programs, cut spending, and you're going to have to do something on the tax side. You ultimately are going to have additional revenues. The question is, how much, when, and in what form is it going to be a consumption tax versus an income tax, and who will bear the burden of that tax? We're the only major industrialized nation that doesn't have some form of consumption tax. When you look at the federal level, when you look at the distribution of wealth and income in the United States today, and also the poverty rates, they're fundamentally different today than they were in the early 1900s when we created the income tax. And I don't think that our policies have kept pace with that fact. So in the final analysis, there will need to be additional revenues. But most people don't like the result of that as a first resort, because there is some truth to the fact that the more money that Washington has, the more money it spends. On the other hand, in the final analysis, you've ultimately got to have enough revenue to pay your current bills and deliver on your future promises. In the final analysis, that will require more revenue.
Podolsky. And my question is, what's your view of the alternative minimum tax and how it's moving down into the middle and lower incomes?
Right. I have had the opportunity to pay the alternative minimum tax for 2 of the last 3 years. I consider that a bait and switch surtax. And it's got to get fixed, because what happened was, when it was brought in, it was intended to make sure that wealthy people paid at least a certain amount in income tax. But the levels were not indexed for inflation. And so therefore, by definition, more and more people are paying this tax. I think there will be a change to the AMT, but that will cost money. And so the question is, how are we going to pay for it? And are we going to pay for it?
Well, I'm interested in how, sorry, my name is Liz Callis and I'm a City Club member, and I'm interested in how we can bring your principles more to our local area. For example, we don't really have anyone here that's doing what you're doing, and we also have a city, and not just Portland, but Beaverton and others that are engaged and have been for some time in some rather lavish spending projects, pet projects, with very little cost-benefit analyses or none of urban renewal subsidies, subsidies or tax breaks for big corporations that want to locate here, where we're competing with other cities and so on. So our auditor won't audit those programs, our news media won't dig up the facts and report them to the public. We don't get cost-benefit analyses of these different schemes. So how can any of what you're saying be introduced here at the local level?
Well, first, the concepts, the challenges I'm talking about exist to a certain extent at the state and local level as well. They have their own challenges to deal with, but in addition to that, bad news flows downhill. When the federal government ends up having to deal with its problem, it means it's going to have an adverse effect on state and local. I think you can take these principles that I'm talking about, these processes, they can be transferred to state and local government levels. You do have accountability professionals at the state level. You have your city auditor here, and I think, I don't know exactly what they're doing, but obviously they have an opportunity to be able to do some of the things that we do at GAO if they have adequate resources and adequate expertise. Thank you.
Hi, Chris Wu, City Club member. And about 3 weeks ago, you were quoted in a USA Today article saying that you believe the United States was in the same position that the Roman Empire was just prior to its collapse. I had the good fortune of being in Rome when I read that, so the example worked for me. And I wanted to know if you could extrapolate on some of the parallels there.
First, I said the Roman Republic, they printed the Roman Empire, which was wrong. As you know, Rome lasted over 1,000 years, but as a republic, it only lasted about 500 years. After that, it was a quasi-dictatorship. Personally, I'm not for quasi-dictatorships. There are several reasons why the Roman Republic fell, some of which resonate today. Number one, lack of a decline in moral values at home and decline of political comedy in MITY. Number two, overextension and overconfidence abroad. And number three, fiscal irresponsibility by the central government. And so what I said was that we need to learn from the lessons of the past. No great republic has stood the test of time. We must be the exception. We can be the exception. I think we will be the exception. But if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. And we don't have enough people who are studying it. We still have time. I didn't talk about that we were at the same point before they fell. I said that we are experiencing some of the same problems that caused them to fall. The good news is we can, we must, and I believe we will address it. We just need to start now.
Kurt Webring, member. You mentioned that a baby born today has about $150,000 in debt. And I have 3 grandbabies, and they're all under 4. And I was looking at the college savings account and what we would need to put them through an in-state public school, and it's about $150,000. And there are going to be 3 of them. And so, personally, I don't know if they can go to college. And so that's a personal possibly tragedy and dilemma. But then when I think of our country, right now we're the brainiest country in the world, so to speak, and we thrive on innovation, and somewhere in here is a question of what are we going to do, I guess.
Well, first, I have 2 granddaughters, 4 and 2, and I have a grandson on the way. And one of the primary reasons that I'm doing what I'm doing is for them. That's one of the primary reasons. I mean, you got to put a face on it. They're the face. I think we need to recognize that in a knowledge-based economy, you've got to have a highly educated, skilled, and knowledgeable workforce. And if you don't, ultimately what's going to happen is it's going to undercut your competitive posture and result in the decline of your standard of living. Clearly, we need to try to address the cost of secondary or post-secondary education. It's becoming beyond the reach for many people, but it's one of the keys for us to maintain our competitive posture and quality of life in the future. Thank you.
Hi, Joanne Kahn, member. You've spoken about healthcare and Social Security costs, but not so much about defense. I was wondering if you could comment on the impact of the war.
Sure. Well, first, if you look at the United States budget in 1964, 46% of it was for defense. In 2004, it's down to 20%. It would have been about 17 or 18 but for Iraq and Afghanistan. What's happened over that 40 years is we've taken money from defense and we've given it to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The Defense Department spends $400 to $500 billion a year, and that's a significant sum. But as I said, if you look at Iraq and Afghanistan and incremental Homeland Security costs, which is primarily the Department of Homeland Security, those aggregate about $100 billion a year. So our deficit problem is not due, to the global war against terrorism or Homeland Security. There is a lot of waste in the Defense Department. We still are building programs, in some cases, based upon Cold War threats, rather than current and future threats. And one of the things that has to be done is to reconcile between what we need to face current and future threats and the wants that many people have in that area. Last thing I would say on defense, defense is the largest single agency in the government that is still not auditable. They are not auditable. And they are probably not, I'm talking about financial statement audit, they're probably not going to be auditable until at least 2008 or 2009. That is unacceptable. And that's got to change. Thank you very much.
We'll be organizing a discussion of these topics online on the City Club website if you'd like to participate. David Walker, Comptroller General United States, thank you very much, and we're adjourned.